Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and thanks a lot for joining this demo. My name is Ulf Andreasson. I work as a solutions engineer here in EMEA for Sumo Logic. And what I'm going to do today in the next couple of minutes is kind of take you through a demonstration of Sumo Logic, the end-to-end observability demo here. And what I want to do with that is just give you an example of the troubleshooting process that an on-call engineer could be taking using Sumo and sort of, having collected all that data into Sumo and really kind of, step by step look at an alert coming in that you react on, and then you explore sort of some metrics and you try to diagnose the problem that you have at hand, and then effectively using different techniques. So pivot from there into looking at traces for the microservices architecture we have and the different services there, and then sort of confirming the root cause using the logs. All of this being collected into Sumo. So that's what we're going to be spending the next couple of minutes on. But before we do that, so I just wanted to kind of briefly make sure that everyone's on the same page with regards to their understanding of Sumo. So Sumo Logic is a software as a service solution, or what we prefer to call it, a unified platform for kind of application infrastructure telemetry, or machine data. So we can bring in pretty much any type of data that's readable for the human being. And of course, with that, we talk about metrics, metadata coming with all those sources there that you bring in, logs and traces. And, we even have customers bring in weather data and sort of other kinds of data sources as well. So that can definitely be something there. But, getting all that data into Sumo, letting Sumo handle the data management of that, and you can concentrate on actually using the data and the analytics that we have within Sumo. So that sort of really kind of makes you much more able to properly monitor the environment you have, diagnose any problems, and specifically sort of troubleshoot so that you can remediate whatever issue you may be fronting. From a DevOps or DevSecOps point of view, right, you kind of use different data sources or different kinds of data, different types of data for different use cases or goals. Monitoring is typically what you do as an on-call engineer, making sure that everything's running fine and it kind of says what it says on the tin. And then basically when you do have a problem, you need to diagnose and really get more in depth of the data. And of course, when you go down to troubleshoot, you really need sort of all kinds of data there. So we're talking logs, we're talking traces, we're talking much more advanced techniques that I'm going to show you today. I also, in this demo here, I also want to kind of set the scene. So what we're talking about here is a banking application. And it's a banking application that runs in an AWS environment. And it basically runs on a Kubernetes cluster. So we have this load balancer in front of it. We then have the payment service that effectively is what I'm running here. And that payment service is being deployed on a Kubernetes cluster and is then talking to other services within my banking environment. And one of those services is the account service, which in its, kind of the accounting service is effectively storing all the data in RDS database. So this is a mission critical application, and the payment and accounting service is kind of running in all the different locations that I have. So for my banking infrastructure there, I'm supporting a lot of different subsidiaries, and those are effectively sort of running this banking application. So, so this is kind of what we're going to do now. obviously I don't want to sit and monitor some dashboards or kind of look at an environment. So what I have is I have my emails or alerts being set up so I can send those as an email, or I can push those into a Slack channel. And in this case, we have a number of different Slack channels where a number of different alerts goes in from a sort of demo environment that we have. Now, in the last couple of minutes here, what has happened here is that I've seen that I have my payment service is breaching an SLO. And I'm effectively getting a link to that. So using webhooks, we can sort of include pretty much any data we want to. So we've included some of the queries that we've been running to kind of find these or to have these alerts. So the backend query that kind of instigates the alert. And then I have sort of a link to playbook itself. So effectively, this is what I can kind of set up. So when I click on this link, that's going to take me into the relevant sort of view within Sumo, so I can get a good understanding of where I am. What this really tells me is that here on this dashboard, I see an elevated error rate that I'm seeing. And what has happened here is that although this may have a lot of variation, and I can see that it fluctuates, what has happened here is that I'm actually breached the deviation of what we expect as normal. So because of that, we have an outlier that we want to act on. And so kind of going from that alert is, it's not only taking me into a dashboard, it takes me into the dashboard with context. So I have exactly the kind of time frame for this. This is effectively a 10-minute interval that we're looking at. And it also has sort of the elevated error rates here. I can see some of the containers or services here that are being affected by the error rates. And of course, this kind of gives me a lot of information. Now, not only am I interested in the error per se, what I also want to see and be able to do is to reach out to those customers who may be affected by this. So having those customer IDs and sort of information about them, I can take this to my customer support team, and they can then reach out to those customers, and we can have a proper communication with them to make sure that they are fine with regards to whatever issue we may have at hand. Now, it's one thing to be able to reach out to customers that are affected by this, but it's also pretty good to be able to see that the transaction volume for ourselves has gone down quite a lot here. So obviously, I can see how much we are impacted ourselves, and that kind of can be critical because you're going to have to prioritize things. You're going to have to be sort of efficient in what you're doing. And then obviously, looking at this both from the customer impact, but also from your own impact, that's kind of critical in that sense. So this can really help me understand. And as you can see here, when this kind of error happened here, we suddenly had a lot less volume in transactions, and therefore the dollars being transferred is affected by that too. So that's obviously a sort of a correlation to the transaction volume. Now, when I start to look at my Kubernetes environment, I can see that the error rates by pod is actually quite high. I mean, the red ones are obviously the kind of bad ones, and green and yellow is kind of okayish, but I can see that I have a lot of red pods. So obviously something is going on here. This is not necessarily just one pod or one sort of component within my system. So this kind of really, puts pressure on me to really be effective in sort of identifying what goes on. So what we can do here is that we can select one of these pods, and we'll be able to get some details for that specific pod. Now, what I want to do is that I'm not necessarily interested in just that single container, because as you can see, because it's affecting so many of those pods, this is probably a bigger problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up the stack, and I'm going to look at the deployment instead. And I have a couple of different things I can pivot into. So I can go into traces, metrics, and logs. But in this case, I actually want to take a look at the application view, because I think, in this case, we want to understand more about what goes on. So by going into the entity dashboard, this is going to take me into our Explorer. And the Explorer, first of all, it tells me that I'm looking at the deployment view of my Kubernetes cluster, and I'm in the mobile banking production cluster for that sort of, that's where my deployment is. So I don't even have to know that. I could have multiple clusters here. This is just one of them. Now, within the mobile banking application, the payment service is one of those, and that runs as a deployment. And I have a lot more here, and we'll take a look at that later. But right now, we focus on sort of dealing with this problem. When I look at this, from a resource perspective, the pods in this cluster seems to be pretty okay. So this is completely different view because this looks at resources, not sort of error rates as we had in the previous view. What I also can see is that the pod seems to be running quite fine. There's not much restarts. Replica seems to be pretty okay. I have sort of a elevated error rates here. There's no question about that. But what I also can see is that I have a lot of connection errors. So obviously, there's a lot of those connection errors. And when I look at the connection errors, it seems that it has to do with the accounting service and connection being refused here. So most of those errors is basically regarding the accounting service. So obviously something with my payment and the accounting service is not working properly. As you know, or I hope you know, but having multiple different services in a Kubernetes cluster, what really happens here most of the times is that there's a lot of communication between these, right? So what I would like to do is look at these connection errors. But what I want to look at is effectively the way they communicate to each other. So if I take a look at this from a tracing perspective, now what I'm going to see now is all these different services having, or all these different connections between the services. And then I can really kind of try to identify any issues with that. So here are all my spans, all my traces. And what I would want to do that. So what's still happening within Sumo is that you get in contact with everything you do. So we're still looking at the banking cluster, we're still looking at the namespace, and we're looking at this deployment. What I would like to add to this filter is basically to say that I want to look at traces that has an error more than one, or sorry, more than zero. So any kind of trace that has an error within it. Now, I can also see that I got a number of traces here, different sort of duration. But I'm going to take the first one just as an example and see what I can find out of that. And I see that I got a number of error spans in here. So let's open this up. And, this is all sort of being taken into Sumo by sort of using the open telemetry framework so that we can bring it in here. Now, when I look at this trace, I get all these spans, and the spans is effectively a sort of a notion for a part of the connection between these different services. So the payment service is communicating to the accounting service. And I have kind of effectively broken down all these spans. And what I seem to have a problem with in this trace is that the find by ID, so effectively my accounting service that trying to find the ID that is being used in the payments is not successful. It's not very simple to see here, but you can see that effectively all of these spans has a kind of a headline that's kind of red. But basically, let's open up this one as well. And here you can see some more information about this. And I have a lot of metadata here. So it's metadata from both the span itself or the application, which I don't really have that much. But then I got my Kubernetes metadata and I got some Sumo metadata on that. So what I want to do here is that I actually want to pivot from this trace trace and span to kind of look at like what could the potential logs be saying about this specific trace. Still being within the time frame and within the trace, what I can see here is that And sadly, there's quite a lot of logs in here. But basically, there seems to be some kind of connection problem here. There's a lot of connection issues, it looks like. So kind of going down the list here, and this list is extensive because we got 3,400 log lines just looking at this, and this is just a 10-minute window. So obviously there's a lot, and what I can do to make life easier is something that some advanced analytics that's only Sumo has, and it's something called log reduce. So what I'm doing with log reduce is that I take all those 3,400 log lines, each and every one. This is not any sampling. This takes every log line, and it's quite speedy, right? Because it's using sort of big data analytics in the sort of back end there. But basically, what I can see here is that my top mentioned, the log line that has the most in this subset of data is effectively a log line saying that connection is not available. And it's timing out. So going down the list here, it basically states that I have a SQL exception or SQL error. And then it basically talks about that too many connections and a SQL error to kind of connect into this. So obviously this is some sort of we're not getting through to the RDS database. And the reason it seems like we can't sort of connect to the database and effectively establish a connection to it so that we can actually run a query and kind of see why, if this user and the identity that's being used with the payment service. So that obviously is kind of what's failing here. Now, as an on-call engineer, my primary goal is to make sure that I get my application up and running again. So the immediate action I would take now is actually going outside of Sumo and communicate or speak to the guys who are in charge of the application as well as the RDS database. And then, we would allocate some more memory, increase the connection pool and make sure that we have more connections being allowed to connect into that, or kind of just make sure that, this connection issue is not going to be an issue for us in the future. Now, so that kind of concludes the way that, okay, we've identified, we've made the application, the payment service to function again, and hopefully that should rectify itself once we're getting into it. But that's not all, because what I also want to do is that I want to make sure that I understand this fully and that I can kind of identify what the root cause behind this is, because it's fine that we've sorted out the database issue, but the question is why? Why now and why at all? So I did sort of say to you that I was going to look at my, I was going to show you my sort of application environment. And as you saw, we had the Kubernetes cluster, but we can also kind of go in and see the complete view of the AWS environment. So here I have a number of different accounts. One of those accounts is effectively my mobile banking application, and I am using that in the US East 2 region. Some of these other accounts I'm using other regions, and I'm effectively using other sort of type of data services within those regions. So there's a lot of information we have in Sumo already, and the way the reason we have this is that we can effectively, when we collect this data, we kind of collect all the data from CloudWatch, CloudTrail, and all the other data services. Then they enrich the data so that when you get into Sumo, you have a full enrichment so that you know exactly which account, region, namespace, and entity we're talking about here. This makes it possible for you to pivot around in these things, not just in a Kubernetes cluster, but also in a sort of, in this case, an AWS environment. Now, what I really want to get to here is not necessarily just look at the environment, because that's fine. But one part of what we have here in Sumo is something called the Root Cause Explorer. And the Root Cause Explorer is actually trying to identify any kind of issues that we may have seen in this environment. And as you can see here, I can, let's kind of open up this a bit more and we'll get some more data sources or data points in here. I'm obviously interested in the kind of last sort of the beginning here, but I just want to show you that, you know, we take different sort of signals. So we take all these metrics, we associate them with different signals, like the golden signals that sort of Google mentions in the SRE handbook. And basically what we can see here is that we have sort of certain aspects of this in my environment is deviating from normal. And obviously, sort of these are the kind of events of interest that you probably should be looking at, or at least you should have an understanding of why they are deviating. And this is all automatically calculated. So when we've had data flowing into Sumo, we'll actually start to sort of calculate these and highlight any outliers and things like that. So you would kind of see things like this, right? And, you know, we don't have any errors here right now, but we seem to have a lot of throughput issues, some sort of load and bottleneck issues, and also some latency issues here. So obviously this environment is not strictly the best, maybe, or maybe not that bad, but you know, we could do better. Now, what I also can do here is I can focus in on just one of the areas here. So in this case, we'll get some issues with my ELB app. I'm not too concerned with that, but what I probably want to look at more is, okay, so here we have some issues with the mobile banking, and we're seeing some bin log disk usage. And anyone who's been running an AWS environment knows that the bin log disk usage is effectively the kind of the log that you have on disk. So effectively, when you get a lot of kind of activities going through your RDS system, then you may have sort of being logs being written down to disk, and that obviously could affect your system. So looking at this, which seems like there is a lot of issues here around this time frame, and that sort of coincides with effectively when I started to see my issues. Now, I should note, I didn't do that now because there wasn't really that many errors. But what I also can do is, of course, I can sort of filter all this information as well. So as much as I just kind of open up the time window for this, I could also sort of filter it based on any kind of entities, or in this case, services, or it could be that I've filtered on regions or whatever it may be as well. Now, let's dig deeper into this, because this obviously is of interest. Looking at the metrics for this, I can effectively see that I have had a window here where it suddenly sort of went up quite dramatically. Now, the green line here is effectively a time shift of 1 day. So that is the same metric, but 1 day ago. So obviously this is something that normally doesn't happen. I even have a time shift for 7 days ago. So I'm kind of comparing today's metric with what I've seen previously. And obviously you can see that this kind of goes up. Now, what I want to do here as well is that I actually want to take a look at this. And, you know, we're looking at this sort of deviation here of the bin log disk usage. We could go and look at some other dashboards and other information that could be of interest. But in this case, I'm just going to go in to look at all the logs. And when I look at all the logs, one thing that does stand out is the kind of slow query. So effectively, MySQL is having these kind of capabilities of running, of identifying slow queries. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of them. I can kind of see it here in the histogram as well, but basically there's a lot of kind of slow queries here. So this is probably sort of also one of the issues of what's happening here, right? And you know, effectively slow queries, if I have a lot of slow queries, what tends to happen is that they start to eat up CPU and sort of connections, and basically taking longer time to process, which means that new kind of connections are not getting in as quickly as they, not getting served as quickly as they should, and therefore that takes even kind of more time, right? So obviously this kind of something I need to watch out for. So we've sort of gone through, we have identified the payment service kind of when it's connected into the accounting service, and that it was the backend database that basically caused the problem. We've seen that one of the reasons for that, or the most likely reason for this, is that we're having a lot of slow queries to this system. So what I probably want to do is that I want to make sure that my RDS service is up to scratch with regards to the workload I have. Now, one way of doing that is that I could go into my alerting, and in this demo, I've already set this up just to kind of make it a bit swifter for you guys. But I have this kind of predict slow query time. And what this basically does is we go out, look at the RDS database, we kind of query, or we extract the query time from it, and we time slice this over 1 hour. Now, this just kind of so that we can visualize it. Now, the beauty, what I do here is that I also use the predict operator. So I can say that this is what's happening now, but I predict that in the next hour, this may increase or decrease or whatever it may be, right? But that is something I want to make use of, because if that happens, so if this kind of really increases and it goes greater than 10, that's when I want to get an alert to myself. So now I can, in this case, I've just set up a simple email, but I could, of course, use webhooks or anything else there. But this way, I will actually get to know when I'm starting seeing slow queries, which could affect my RDS database, and then I can be much more proactive and making sure that we can sort of clarify these kind of issues before those happens. So that's kind of concluding the demo per se. Now, I didn't say that initially, but of course you are welcome to kind of ask me any questions, just put them in the QA, the kind of chat window there, or the Q&A window, and I'll definitely do that. So just while you're doing that, I'm just going to kind of take you through one more slides to kind of summarize what you saw here. So basically, we didn't get the alert via email. I got it in Slack instead because I kind of prefer that, but we all different. We can do it any way you want effectively. From that alert, we basically were taking into relevant view. So we saw that the error rates were increasing. We could understand who was impacted of it. We also understood how much we were impacted from it, so that we could actually make use of that to sort of prioritize things. Then we could go into the Explorer, and we could really understand the different services and get a much more kind of clarified picture of how things are keeping up and how things are holding together. From there on, and we saw the connection issues. So my intent or my sort of immediate reaction to that is that if we're talking a lot of connection issues, then I would look at the traces for that. We could see in one of those traces that basically we were having sort of issues with connecting to a database. So obviously, I didn't go into more of the traces, but I would probably see the same thing in all of those traces, because it basically had the same sort of latency and the same time. So from there on, we could really kind of rectify the problem, make sure that we could get up to running again by sort of adding more sort of CPU and memory to the database. Now, just to conclude the whole thing, we wanted to kind of use the root cause explorer to identify the real reason for the load in the RDS database or MySQL database. And once we've sort of identified the slow queries there, we could understand why we then kind of running out of connections in the kind of with regards to payment service. So using that information, we can then kind of set up an alert so that we can be much more proactive in instead of kind of being reactive there. And that's really what you kind of saw in this demo. So I'm hoping that was kind of useful for you. And with that, I'm open for any questions. So let me see, I'm looking here. So one question is, the classification of signals that we showed in the demo. So yeah, I think what's being asked here is effectively when you look at the classification of the signal events. So these ones are sort of taken from actually looking at the documentation for Root Cause Explorer, which kind of goes through quite a lot of, like, you know, some of the views here that you've already seen, but also some of the typical problems that you may see, right? So spikes and context and correlation. But the point is that the way we do this, the way we classify this is kind of really taken from the Google SRE handbook. So it really talks about load and latency and bottleneck and errors. Because if you can handle load and latency, then that typically sort of, then you can hopefully sort of not really get into the bottlenecks and errors. But we kind of basing that on that. So we get a couple of more signals, so to speak, here, like throughput and availability, but effectively it's all sort of with that notion. Another question here is that how we are pricing this, and it's actually fairly simple because Sumo is all about sort of the amount of ingest of data you send into Sumo. So what happens here is that you would kind of push the data into Sumo, and we would kind of calculate that, you know, before we looked at an average. But effectively what happens today is that you have credits and then you use those credits. So it's incredibly strong in that sense. And you know, we have a lot of customers really liking this because it means that you really pay as you go. You pay exactly for what you're looking at and how you use it. So you can, one day you may ingest a lot more metrics, or the other day you may ingest a lot more logs. You also have the data tiering capability. So you can effectively ingest data just into archive for free. Then you can also ingest data that you don't really index anything, but we would scan that data when you want to run a query against it. So you don't actually pay for ingesting it, but you pay for the kind of queries that you may be running against it. And of course, if you have any real-time data, that goes in as well, and then you're paying a charge for that based on the ingest. Or you consuming credits based on the ingest. So it's very simple. Another question here. So manage abstracted Kubernetes solutions like EKS and GKE. Does Sumo Logic also monitor the control plane master nodes? Yes, indeed we do. So let me show you, if I go into the app catalog, what you will see here, and we can look at the DevOps. So we do have a Kubernetes app. And this is effectively the app that looks at sort of Kubernetes, the pods, the containers, effectively the application workload. Now, if you run this within GKE, as in Google Compute Engine, you have the Google Compute Engine control plane. So that will kind of give you the view of all the entities in Google. So the stack driver monitoring logs, the GKE API server, effectively the kind of information there. Same thing is like, if you're running EKS, then you have the EKS control plane, and of course, similar with regards to AKS. So yes, we would pick the data for the Kubernetes cluster, but we'll also pick the backend data for each and every service there. Another question, what is the max retention of data in Sumo? Max retention, it's actually, let me show you. It's always easy to kind of look at it, but max retention data in Sumo is effectively 5,000 days. I'm sorry, that wasn't much I could show in here, but I could just say, like, I got some data here, and I would create what we call as a partition. Think of a partition as an index or a kind of subset of the data. I have some kind of routing expression. So say, for example, all my Windows systems in my labs environment is going to go into, one day Windows lab. And then I would say, okay, 1 day I want for retention, or I could say 5,000 days. Now, in the long run of it, I'm not going to kind of create this partition, but that's the way it is. And by the way, 5,000 days is roughly 13 and a half years. So that's kind of what you have there. Now, commercially, you can decide that you want to have 30 days or whatever it is. This is not a big cost. The big cost for getting data into Sumo, that's kind of the ingest and all that. That's really, the retention, the metrics, these are typically just a fraction of the cost there. So it's very flexible in that way. And you can really kind of change this to, you can really just create another kind of partition, and then you can decide. So if you got some developer data or something like that, you can just push it in there and you would be good to go. Yeah, I think we had those. Any other questions or? Yep. So I'm open for any other questions if you have that. In the meantime, one question that I've been asked a lot is regarding this kind of Explorer view, because the reason for this is really we want to make you efficient, right? And having a lot of dashboard, that's good. But having a way to traverse those dashboards in a meaningful way, that's even better. So what I want to kind of show you here is effectively that when you look at an environment, you're obviously going to be kind of looking at a dashboard. Now, you could have multiple different dashboards. Sorry, I didn't have much there for that one. If I look at my production environment or my prod level, okay. Let me look at a Kubernetes environment then, because here I know I have a lot of dashboards. So you could have multiple different dashboards that could be sort of related to that, or that would be useful for that. Now, it all depends on what you're looking at. So therefore, the beauty with this is that when I look at the banking app and my cluster explorer, I see the view of that. When I look at my coffee bar and the explorer for that, then I see that environment. Now, effectively think of it like this. I got one single dashboard, but I'm dynamically linking all the data going into that dashboard. So it's much, much more efficient. If you change this dashboard, you changed all the views for everyone and so on. So it's just different ways of doing it. But you can definitely create your dashboards and you can keep those outside of the Explorer, but you can also use them in the Explorer, which really kind of just means that you can pivot around all these things much more efficiently. Now, what I kind of meant to say as a question and answer is that these hierarchies here, these are things that you can define on your own. So we've created some out of the box content, but you can create your own hierarchy. So if you get applications, if you get kind of things that you want to represent in a specific way, you can do that. The only thing is that, creating the hierarchy and then having the metadata, so you can sort of get that data into the right sort of type of hierarchy and right type of object. That's kind of something that a lot of customers have been very keen on working with. And that's, we're going to make it much easier going forward, but it's kind of something that I'm very excited about kind of working with as well. But I don't see any more questions. So in that case, I want to thank you for today and hoping that you've kind of felt that this was valuable. If you have any questions, reach out to your kind of account team, or you're free to kind of give me, send me an email at ulf@sumologic.com. I'm always happy to help. And if nothing else, we also have the community that you can go to. So effectively going to Sumo Logic, you have the sort of get support, you get the documentation and sales and all these kind of things. And of course you get some resources under the community. So there's a Slack channel and all those things. And of course, there's a lot of resources here from a demo perspective and so on as well. Now, what you also can do, is to take out your free trial with Sumo. So just providing your email address and deciding where you want to run it. We got a couple of different regions you can run in. And then, then you have a 30-day free of use, using the enterprise version, so the full flexibility that could be. But that said, always reach out. We're happy to help, and we're happy to kind of take you through, so that you don't have to go through all the documentation, stuff like that, to understand it. It is fairly simple, but still making the most of it. It's we're here to help you doing that. So with that, thanks a lot for today, and I hope you found it valuable.